So we're back and we're going to be looking at the line tool and the circle tool in more detail, and we'll get some general ideas of how ArchiCAD organizes the different menus. So this whole menu over here is called the info bar, and if we look here, this is the info bar. The toolbox is the actual tools. I like putting the info bar vertically on the side. I think it's easier to read. Some people put it along the top. It's up to you. You can move it around. In this screen, in this palette, I should say, we have some favorites, which are, these are predetermined line types with all the settings in a particular way. So if I'm going to draw cabinet lines, I can select that and it changes all of the properties. So what are those properties? Well, the properties I have access to from this screen are a little different than if I double click that screen. And this is all of the properties available to me for the line. Now the line doesn't have a lot of properties, but if I were to select a window or a door, there's pages and pages of different choices that I can use to make that window or door, whatever object I'm using, to be exactly the way I want. Lines, we only have so many choices. So this is one way to get to the information. I don't normally use this for a line because everything I need is able to be contained here in this window. I have a single line, I have multiple lines, I have a rectangle, and I have a rotated rectangle. And I'm going to go through these really fast. They're assuming you've used other computer programs. I mean, these are really fundamental. These aren't going to feel too strange to you, but a line is click, click for a line. I never ever use this. I don't want to have to start the line again and start the line again and keep going. I always use the chain line, and it's a double click to stop. The rectangle is useful, and I can either use X and Y, R and A, or in this case, I can use dimensions. So I can hit 20 tab 12, and that gives me a rectangle that's 20 feet wide, 12 feet tall. I can hit M for measure, and there it is. Now I'm going negative X, so you're seeing I'm getting a negative X value. I could just hit escape, go this way, and hit M again, and see that I get positive values. Now escape is something you're going to use all the time. Something I didn't mention before. That's how you get out of a command. So if I'm drawing, I hit L to draw a rectangle. I go and I go, oh, I don't want to do that rectangle. I can go up here and switch. If I don't want to do a rectangle at all, I can hit escape. Now the rotated rectangle is, I just choose the first edge of the rectangle, can be either direction. I click it and I click again, and that gives me the rectangle. I can use keyboard entry methods to make that precise. I have line types. So I'm going to go in here, and now I'm drawing with the cut line. I have all of these available, or I can go through and actually create my own. I have pens. Now we haven't talked a lot about pens. I'll go ahead and do that now. And we'll have another video that gets into this a little deeper. I don't use a lot of pens. When you first open ArchiCAD, this whole thing's filled with colors, and I find it overwhelming and very hard to enforce any standards. So if you reduce the number of pens, your standards for your office are a lot easier. These are my black pens. These are my halftones. You'll notice up here, the millimeters or the points. This is how thick the lines are. So this is 0.9 points, which is pretty thick. It's 72 points per inch, to put that in perspective. And then I can go all the way down to 1.5, which is my heavy line. 0, which is the finest line that ArchiCAD will create. 0.1, you get the idea. And so they're also labeled what type of pen they are: objects, setbacks, contours, fills, cuts, so that I can try to use these pens as consistently as possible. Now what I do is, these pens moving down are the same weight, but different halftones. And you can have halftone for any of these. I just do a couple. Again, if I have too many choices, it's just too hard to enforce any standards. These are what I use for my fills for my 2D shapes, my hatches, if you're from a AutoCAD background. And these are just an array of colors with no weight significance. It's just a visual representation. I use these all for my fills and just to find a pretty color, really more than anything. The colors don't necessarily mean anything. They don't have a different weight. They're specifically used for fill. So that's how I use my pens. And all I gotta do is select a pen and go. The drafting line, cut line, skin separator, this is something you rarely have to get into. They're very, it's a very subtle part of the program. We'll cover that later when we're trying to understand how to create our drawings to look exactly the way we want. Now, what I like about ArchiCAD is that I'm going to go back to my chain line. I can put an arrow on any line, but not just an arrow. I can do any of these end types. I can put it on both ends or either end. I can control the size. And of course, I can control the color of each of those. So here, you'll notice that arrow is really small. I can bring this up to 4 points. It just depends on our scale, which is a whole nother module that will cover that. I have a blue arrow. I can do a filled arrow, filled long arrow. I can have it be the same color, same pen type. I can select it, change the end, or do both ends. So if I have an element selected, then I'm going to actually change the property of that line that's selected. And you're going to get feedback up here because it's going to say this one is one selected. And I'll go in here, whatever's selected, I am now changing. If nothing's selected, like it says here, well, let's go back to the line tool. These are the defaults. So now I'm changing the defaults for the next line. So whatever line I'm going to draw next will hold these default properties. So that will be the default. This will be the default. And that's a really helpful, it's helpful to understand exactly what that means. So if I select all of these, whichever property I change, let's say I want to turn all the lines, the arrows or the arrowheads off. Now I selected them and all of them are off. Now, if they were different line types, it wouldn't have affected the line type because I didn't actually change that property in the screen. So it's only going to affect the properties that I change when they're selected. I can do all 4 selected. Let's say I want to make them all pen number 1. If one is already pen number 1, then I have to select, change it, and then change it back to make the computer understand, oh, that's a property I wanted to change. So I got to change it away from the one I want and then back to it. And play with that a little bit. I think you'll find that it's pretty easy to understand. So that is what's going on over here in the screen. Now, what's great about ArchiCAD is that if I go to the circle tool, which I can either hit here or hit C, very similar. I have my arrows. All of this is exactly the same. My pen, my line types, my layer, which is a whole nother module. Every element in ArchiCAD goes on a layer. The layer is either shown or not shown. We can have layer combinations that allow us to depict the drawing the way we want. Not for right now, don't worry about what layer. Just know that the ArchiCAD layer is a layer that's always on and always visible. And while you're sketching around here, that's a perfectly fine layer to use. In other circumstances, it can be a little problematic if you're not using it very deliberately. We have 3 different geometry methods here for circles. We have 3 geometry methods for ellipses, and they're fairly simple. Notice at the bottom here, you're getting some feedback. It's saying complete the arc. Click. At any of these times, we can use our keyboard to put in exact values, type the number, tab, type the next number, enter, and that ellipse then is contained within that box. And that is the type of ellipse geometry method that we had selected. If we want to do center and the corner of this apparent box, we would do the same thing. We can also do click, click, and then you change how oblique the ellipse is. So these are not things that you're going to understand unless you absolutely just sit there and tootle around with them until it starts to make sense to you. So I'm going to hit the arrow tool, Control A and delete, and that clears my screen. And we'll see you in the next video.